Next up in the bathroom series was getting the floor tile installed in the bathroom and shower in the not so tiny house. And in case you missed the last video, I covered how I got the shower pan installed and waterproofed, and before installing the floor tile, I also needed to install the uncoupling membrane on the floor to waterproof the floor outside of the shower. Before doing that, I decided to go ahead and undercut the door trim and jamb to give myself more clearance to install the membrane and floor tile, and an oscillating multi-tool makes really quick work of this task. I used a piece of 1/2-inch drywall as a cutting guide here, but this didn't end up giving me as much clearance as I needed, and I still had to cut away more material later, so I probably would have used a piece of 3/4-inch material here in retrospect. Also, in case you're wondering how this door got here, I got it installed while we were installing the wall tile, since the wall tile butts right into the door trim. And I'll cover all of that in the next video on the wall tile, so stay tuned for that. With the door undercut, I could get a few pieces of the uncoupling membrane, Schluter Dietra in this case, cut to size. And I happen to have just enough of this material left over from when I installed the floor tile in my laundry room a few years back, and even though it meant cutting it into more pieces, I figured I might as well use it up so I didn't have to keep storing it in our garage. Also, I picked up a tip from Bob at I Like to Make Stuff and learned that cutting this stuff is much easier from the back face, since you're not fighting with all those pockets, sending your utility knife off course. After cutting the pieces to size, I marked where I needed to notch them around the door opening, and it's generally a good idea to hold these pieces back about 1/4 of an inch around all the edges to allow for expansion, as well as for ease of installation. Prior to adding the thinset, we vacuumed up the floor and made sure to remove any debris and dried thinset from the wall tile installation. Next, I could get the thinset added to the floor, and I used a modified thinset here, and this is actually some of the leftover thinset from installing the wall tiles. And installing this membrane is kind of the perfect task for the end of a workday, as you can use up any of that leftover thinset you might have, and then let the whole thing dry overnight, which makes working on top of the membrane a whole lot easier. After getting the thinset troweled out, I could set the first piece of Dietra in place and get it worked into the thinset, and a grout float works great for this. And you really want to work it in well, making sure that fleece backing on the Dietra is well adhered to the thinset, and I pulled back the membrane around the edges to check for good coverage. And as you can see, I was a little light around this far edge, so I added a little bit more thinset before working the membrane in, and then I could move on to the next section.
Okay. Nice.
And this is really a much better angle showing the troweling, and you can see that I'm really working the thinset into the subfloor before troweling in the notched pattern. Once it was worked in, I came back with the notch side of my trowel, and I used a 1/4 inch by 3/16 inch V-notch trowel as recommended by Schluter. Also, I should have probably added more water to my thinset at this point, as it was a little bit thick for this application, and I really got a workout here. With that done, I could get the next piece of Dietra set in place, and it was at this point that I realized we had notched this piece in the wrong orientation. But thankfully we could make it work by adding one more small scrap piece to fill in the floor. And all these seams will be taped later on, so it didn't matter too much, but it was still pretty annoying. Anyway, I got that piece worked into the thinset and then repeated the process for the other 2 pieces of Dietra to finish off the floor. The last thing I decided to do was go ahead and pre-fill the cavities in the Dietra with more of the same thinset, mostly because I had a bunch of it left and didn't want to just throw it away. Now, I realized this was a modified thinset, and Schluter recommends using an unmodified thinset to install tile over Dietra. That said, I knew it was going to be at least a week before I got to actually installing the tile over the Dietra portion of this floor, so I figured the thinset would have plenty of time to dry before installation. Anyway, I called it a day at that point, and a few days later, I came back to start getting the floor tile installed in the shower area. And for the floor tile, I used this beautiful porcelain hexagon mosaic from Florida Tile's Sequence collection, and the first thing I needed to do was figure out how I was going to lay out these pieces on the floor. I did a test layout using some 1/8 inch spacers between the mosaic pieces and ended up just a bit wider than the floor, so I figured I could try ripping one of the mosaics in half and see how that worked out. And I used this new beast of a tile saw to rip the sheet, and while certainly not necessary for a job like this, having this tile saw made this project a heck of a lot easier, and I definitely recommend renting or buying something like this if possible.
If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up.
So as luck would have it, ripping the mosaic in half lengthwise ended up being just about perfect, leaving me with a 3/16 of an inch gap around the edges of the floor for expansion, so I went with that for my layout. The other decision to make prior to getting to tiling was which of the two drain cover options I wanted to use for the linear drain. And the Prova linear drain kit came with a tile in top, but it seemed like it would have been extremely tricky to try and get the tiny pieces in this top to line up with the tiles on the floor. Tools for Flooring also sells this stainless steel grate that is also made for this linear drain, and I figured this would be a lot easier to install, and I also think I just like the look of this stainless steel grate more, so I opted for that option. The last step prior to installing the tile was to clean up the shower pan, and we vacuumed the area off camera before finally wiping it down with a damp sponge to remove any debris or dust. With that, I could get started with installing the tile, and I mixed up a batch of this Mapei uncoupling membrane mortar, which worked great for this floor tile installation since it was an unmodified mortar. And I used a 1/4 inch by 3/16 inch V-notch trowel to add the thin set, but I should mention that I ended up switching to a slightly larger notch pattern, a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch square notch trowel on the second day of installation, and I think that worked a lot better here. Anyway, after troweling, I set the first piece of mosaic in place, and I added 3/16 inch wedge spacers where the sheet met up with the wall to allow room for expansion and contraction, and I also added a few 1/8 inch spacers to the tiles set in the mosaic mat to space them a little more consistently. To finish off the corner, I added a small piece to fill in that area, adding more wedges and spacers to keep that piece in place, and then I can move on to my first full mosaic sheet. After getting that sheet set in place, I ran into my first piece that needed to be cut around the linear drain. So I marked where my cuts needed to be and then headed over to the tile saw to make the cut. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite complete the cut with the tile saw because of the round blade on the saw, so I headed outside to finish the cut with my angle grinder and a diamond cutting wheel. And when making these more tricky cuts with the angle grinder on these mosaic sheets, I found that just removing the individual piece from the mosaic sheet made cutting them a lot easier, and in no time, I had the corner cut cleaned up. After cutting, I test fit the piece around the linear drain, and it seemed to fit well, so I moved on with getting those pieces set in place with more wedges and spacers. I filled in the empty spots closest to the wall with more small pieces, and I also back buttered these pieces since that mesh backing on the mosaic had the tendency to kind of block some of the thin set. Once those were set in place, I could finish up the rest of the first row, repeating the same process to notch the next mosaic piece around the linear drain, and then installing another full mosaic and finishing the row with one of the rip sheets. From there, it was really just rinse and repeat to tile the rest of the shower pan, and my biggest recommendation here would be to use more spacers than you think you need. These smaller mosaic tiles really have the tendency to move around, even with the mesh backing, if they're not kept in place with spacers. Case in point, I ended up kind of scrunching up some of these tiles when I test fit the drain cover about halfway through installing the shower tiles, and I had to frantically readjust these tiles after figuring out what had happened, which was pretty tricky since the thin set was starting to set up. Also, unfortunately, I seriously underestimated the number of spacers I'd need and ran out at this point in the install. And since I had that batch of unmodified thin set mixed up, and it would have dried by the time I ran out to buy more spacers, I decided to just go ahead and tape the edges and seams on the uncoupling membrane to use up the thin set. So I first taped the 3 edges of the uncoupling membrane where it met up with the shower curb and the left and right walls, since these are the main areas where water will end up on the floor, and I added thin set using that same V-notch trowel before setting a 5-inch wide strip of Prova mat in place, lapping it onto the floor and up the wall about 2.5 inches. I pressed the strip into the thin set with the straight edge of the trowel, really working it in and removing any excess thin set below the strip to avoid too much buildup in these areas. I lapped the pieces for the left and right walls onto the piece for the curb to totally waterproof that corner, and then I could tape the large seam in the middle of the floor to wrap up the waterproofing. Also, I'm not worried about those edges closest to the door that I didn't tape, as technically the wall panels were already sealed to the subfloor during installation, so I've already got 2 layers of waterproofing there. Plus, if I end up with that much water on the floor this close to the door leading out of the bathroom, I'll have much bigger problems on my hands. I started the next day by cleaning up all the excess thin set from the joints between the tiles and the surface of the tiles. And this is definitely one of the least enjoyable parts of tile work, but it's an absolute necessity to get these areas cleaned up while the thin set is still green, preferably, because otherwise you'll have to work twice as hard to do the same work. And I found that a 5-in-1 tool, a grout saw, and a white Scotch-Brite pad are really helpful when doing this kind of cleanup work, and as you can see, I eventually got the tiles looking pretty great. Before mixing up the next batch of thin set, I decided to go ahead and dry fit the majority of the tiles I needed to finish off the shower pan area, as well as the pieces for the curb. And I would personally recommend dry fitting as many of your tiles as possible if you're newer to tile work like I am, especially if you're working by yourself. Because once that thin set is mixed up, you're working against the clock, and I find myself a lot less stressed and end up with a much better result if I pre-cut the pieces, and that was definitely the case here as well. Luckily, the pieces for the side of the curb facing the shower ended up being simple to cut since they were basically just half pieces of this hexagon tile, but that wasn't the case for the other side of the curb. So after dry fitting the pieces, I took some measurements so I could cut the pieces for that face of the curb, and I ended up with kind of an awkward cut since I wanted the floor tile to appear to wrap up the curb. And these cuts involved a lot more ripping, and again, this tile saw was a huge help here, as you can see. So the larger sections of mosaic for this curb were pretty easy to cut since they were a pretty simple crosscut, but the smaller filler pieces that needed to go between these larger sections ended up being much trickier. And I could have cut these pieces as a full mosaic and just removed the pieces I didn't need, but this would have been really wasteful and I didn't have enough extra tile to do it that way. Instead, I needed to cut these small pieces from the individual hexagon tiles, but since they're a hexagon, there's not really a great reference surface to have against the fence of the saw. Thankfully, I figured out that two matching offcuts worked great as a kind of fixture to hold the tile in place square to the fence while I cut it, and this worked out great. I repeated the process for the rest of the tiles for this face of the curb, and I am so glad I did all this prior to mixing up the thin set because it took quite a while. Also, I should mention that I tried using this snap cutter from toolsforflooring.com here, but due to the orientation of the tiles on the mosaic, it didn't really work well for this application. It was great for snapping the tiles in half, but that was about it. That said, we used this snap cutter a ton when installing the wall tile, which you'll see in the next video. Anyway, the last thing I wanted to do before mixing up that next batch of thin set was to figure out exactly where I was going to end the tile in the doorway to the bathroom. I used one of these Schluter Reno TK strips to transition from the floor tile to where the engineered hardwood flooring will be installed, since I needed to step down the height slightly, and I cut the strip to length off camera with my miter saw. I knew I wanted this transition strip located below the bottom edge of the door when it was closed, so it wouldn't be visible when the door was closed. So since the door swings into the bathroom, I centered the strip in that section of the jamb between the jamb stop and the trim. I also went ahead and cut away that excess Ditra which I had installed well past where I knew the strip would end up, and I should have done this a little earlier while the thin set wasn't so well cured because these pieces were a total pain to remove. And I am definitely not worried about this membrane coming loose from the subfloor anytime soon. Anyway, once that was done, I could finally get the thin set mixed up and get to laying tile, which went really smoothly since most of my pieces were pre-cut. Adding the tiles to the inside face of the curb was a little tricky since I had to contend with the sloped shower pan, but thankfully the slope wasn't very severe and I could make minor adjustments by switching between a 1/16 of an inch and an 1/8 inch spacer here. I repeated the process installing the tiles on the outer face of the curb, and once that was done, I could really start moving since there were mostly full mosaic sheets here. And I basically just worked my way out towards the doorway since I couldn't step on these tiles after setting them, and eventually got to the point where I needed to install the transition strip. To do this, I added thin set to that area and then set the strip into the thin set, using the edge of the Ditra as a reference point to get it set correctly. Next, I could take some measurements for my last few pieces and get them cut off camera, and I was excited to see that I could use full pieces of mosaic here. In retrospect though, I wouldn't have cut the pieces this way as I ended up having to fill in these tiny pieces next to the transition strip, which was a total pain. Instead, I would have added another row of tiles so I could just cross-cut the final sheet as one assembly, so the slivers would have been attached to the mesh backing. Anyway, on this rightmost mosaic, I ended up completely spacing on the fact that I needed to notch the last tile around the door, so it ended up short, but thankfully I could just remove that one tile and replace it with another single tile. On the final mosaic piece, I inch monstered myself and cut the sheet 1 inch too short, so I had to recut it, and I was starting to kind of get into panic mode at this point since the thin set I had already laid was drying out a bit, and to help combat this, I back buttered the entire mosaic sheet, but as you can see, this caused a ridiculous amount of squeeze out between the tiles, which was a real pain to clean up. Anyway, I got that piece fit, and then it was on to the home stretch, fitting those last 4 slivers, which, as I mentioned, were pretty darn annoying. Thankfully, I just took my time here and back buttered the pieces before installing them, and eventually got the pieces fitting really nicely before taking a step back and taking a look at my work. And I was really happy with how the floor tile was looking at this point. I got all the spacers removed and the excess thin set cleaned up off camera the next day, and then a few days later, I could get to grouting. And I've had pretty bad luck with pre-mixed grout, so I decided to try something different here and mix up some bagged grout. And I found this stuff much easier to work with, and it set up a lot more slowly, so I didn't feel like I was fighting the grout drying on the surface of the tiles. To apply the grout, I used a grout float and worked the grout into the joints, making sure to work it in from multiple directions to ensure it completely filled the joints. I worked in small, manageable sections, and once I had all the joints filled, I cleaned up the bulk of the excess grout before moving on to the next section. Also, I upgraded to this nicer grout float for this project, and let me tell you, it makes a world of difference versus the cheap float I had been using on my previous projects. Anyway, I got the majority of the shower pan and some of the area outside of the shower pan grouted, and by that point, the first section had started to set up enough so I could wipe off the excess grout with a damp sponge. And wiping off the excess grout requires a little bit of care, as you don't want to wipe away too much grout from your joints, and also if your sponge is too wet, you risk washing the color out of your grout. And I've always found this process a little bit stressful, trying to know when my sponge is wet enough, so on this project I decided to try out this awesome grout sponge system made by Raimondi. And I first saw this system in a Perkins Builder Brothers video a while back and knew it would make grouting much easier, and it definitely did. And these rollers help to remove just enough water, leaving you with a consistently damp sponge. And I just continued wiping away the excess grout until I was satisfied with how the surface was looking, and then I could move on to grouting the rest of the floor. And the trickiest part of this process was trying to grout an area just large enough so I could still reach it all without stepping on wet grout, which you really don't want to do. Overall, the process went smoothly though, and this one 10-pound bag of grout ended up being perfect for this floor with just a tiny bit left over at the end. I let the grout dry overnight and then came back the next morning to clean up any haze, which I definitely had. And this was kind of unavoidable since I was applying gray grout over gray tiles, and it was really difficult to see where any streaks of grout were left on the surface of the tile while everything was wet. This wasn't a huge deal though, I just needed to use a little elbow grease, some water, a sponge, and one of these grout scrubbing pads to remove the haze. And the haze is a lot easier to remove if you wet the surface slightly, and once the surface was wet, I could get to scrubbing, working in sections. Once I felt like I had removed the haze, I wiped the area down with a clean sponge and then dried the surface with a towel to make sure any grout suspended in the water was removed. And I definitely worked up a sweat doing this, but it made a huge difference in the overall look of the floor, and I think it looks really great now. Next, I needed to address the area around the linear drain, as I ended up with a little bit of chipping along those edges when I trimmed the pieces to fit the drain. To fix this, I decided to add a little bit of a bevel to the edges of the tiles, which I thought would look nice since the color of the tile edges also matched the grout. And I used a set of diamond polishing pads for this, and these are the same pads I used on my GFRC outdoor dining table I built a few weeks ago. And I just worked my way up through the grits, taking my time, and I think the edges ended up looking really great. And I'm really not sure how you'd cut these pieces perfectly cleanly without some sort of edge polishing like this, so I'd say to just plan on this step if you're using a linear drain, since these cut edges aren't covered with grout like they are with a typical drain. And with that done, I could call the floor tile installation complete. Alright guys, I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up for this one. Obviously, the last step in installing this floor tile will be to caulk around the whole perimeter of the room, where the curb meets the floor, that kind of thing. But as you can probably see, the floor is covered up right now with some ram board so that I didn't make a mess of it when finishing up the wall tile installation. Next week's video will be on installing all of this wall tile and basically wrapping up the tile installation here in this house. And let me tell you, it has been quite the process. So I am definitely ready to get that done. And then after that, I'm actually going to be heading over to the shop to build the floating bathroom vanity, which I am really excited about. I've got a super cool design worked up for that. So if you guys don't want to miss all of those future videos, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss those. Also, I'll have links to all of the tools and materials I used in this video, as always, down in the video description below. And last, I want to say a big shout out to all of my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members. You guys are awesome. I'll have links to both of those programs here on the screen. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.